Tubbert. He was the head of the Froebel College of Education in Froebel for over 10 years. He has worked abroad in numerous countries, and he's going to tell us now about Froebel and Maria.
First thing I'll say is I'm not a professor. It says I'm a professor now. I'm not a professor, or never was. And I also suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome at the moment. I just make a start. One of the things Froebel said, which I always think about in modern society, is he said we should be wandering and wondering. So maybe a day like today is a day for wandering and wondering. It's where we take time out of our busy lives and maybe do a bit of thinking and a bit of sharing and so on. So a bit of wandering and wondering does no one any harm. Okay, the approach I took was to look at the similarities between them, because the more I read about Maria Edgeworth, I was always interested in her. I remember Castle Rackrent, of course most people do, and I knew about practical education. I had a brief look at it many years ago, so I went back at it again. And the words may be different. Some of them may be similar to Froebel, they may be a bit anachronistic, but the ideas and the philosophy behind it is just so, you just keep seeing more and more similarities between them. Sorry, I have to pick this up here. So one of the things that struck me immediately was that there was kind of grief in that in their early childhood. And Froebel's mother died when he was only 1 year old, and Maria Edgeworth's mother died when she was young. And I think that had an influence, that the lack of a mother person, even though Maria Edgeworth had a happy relationship with the women later in her life, in her family life. And so did Froebel. He went to live with an uncle eventually and became much happier there. But certainly in Froebel's case, it led to this idea of a solitary childhood, where he became interested in nature and would go off wandering and learning and communing with nature. Became an apprentice forester, again, a kind of a lonely, solitary occupation, particularly in those days. He went on and he kind of messed around with different things before he came to education. He studied maths and metallurgy, I can never pronounce that word. He became a tutor to a wealthy family, and this is where the kindergarten came from. He began to experiment with the children, and here again we see similarities with Maria Edgeworth, with her younger siblings and other children, where they began to observe children. And I think that begins to show again what Joanne was talking about, this observation of children, this intense observation of children. But rather than looking at the ethics of it, again, we have to be careful. The context of the times is very important in historical empathy. And we have to understand the language they were using and the thinking of the time. But that idea of observation of children was quite revolutionary, that you would learn from the children. Froebel later says, I start with the child. Sorry, I'll move that on. They were influenced by Rousseau, as been said before, Emile, and this idea that it was really a treatise, it was an idea. Pestalozzi was the person who really put it into practice. Froebel goes to visit Pestalozzi. And I think this is, if you listen to the previous speakers, Maria Edgeworth also travelled and people travelled to her. And when you think of those days, no Ryanair in those days, the commitment they had to learn from each other was phenomenal. I mean, it might take them weeks to go and visit, which of course insinuates that most of them were wealthy people. Froebel unfortunately didn't fit that character. Many of his schools, he wasn't the best financier either. Many of the schools were closed down because teachers weren't paid because of financial difficulties and so on. So he certainly wasn't entrepreneurial. It was a time of great change. Froebel was 1782 to 1852, and Maria Edgeworth was 1768 to 1848. So they did mirror each other greatly, and it was tumultuous times. the interesting thing about Rousseau, in the context of again, where Froebel looked on children as innately good, the humankind is innately good, so did Maria Edgeworth, and this comes through in her trust of children and her respect for children, as was with Froebel. So Rousseau was had to flee to Paris from Switzerland because he disputed the idea of original sin. And again, a lot of that thinking comes out of the Enlightenment. And if you look at the father, he was a member of the RDS, which of course was one of the scientific clubs, agricultural scientific clubs, where they experimented and so on. And those clubs were regular features of the Enlightenment, where people would come together on a Tuesday night or Wednesday night, somewhere, anywhere in the world, and they would just discuss scientific facts. Now, they're seen as kind of anti-religious, which wasn't true. What they were questioning was the superstitions of religion and the unfounded things like what we would have grown up indulgences and paying for I'm trying to think of some of the other words which are now anachronistic, I suppose. But they were questioning that idea, and of course the Inquisition and anyone with alternative ideas. So it wasn't anti-religious, but it was demanding that religion be the pure thing that it was originally supposed to be, but that was mixed up with, because they questioned religion, it was seen as anti-religious. So this idea of children as being innately good breeds then, also what was said by earlier speakers, is this idea of respect for childhood. And Froebel declared the independent republic of childhood. And you think of those days, children were dressed like little adults, and they were meant to be seen and not heard. Even in my time, I was supposed to be seen and not heard. It was very difficult for me. But this idea that they were just on their way to being an adult, and you were training them to be an adult. Froebel and Maria Edgeworth as well were saying, no, childhood is a value in itself. And at each stage, and here we come to stages of development, you referenced Piaget, and I did a comparison at one stage between what Piaget was saying and what Froebel was saying, and these idea of stages of development. Now, some people would say it's a little boxed off and it's more fluid, but the same idea that each stage of development is of value in itself. And the art of the teacher is to see when the child is ready to move to the next stage and to support that child in the move to the next stage. So Froebel also said, like, the curriculum is the child. I start with the child. So now we're moving to the modern idea of child-centeredness, again, which was mentioned before. The idea of the development of the whole child, the social, emotional development. Both of them talk about the moral context, not necessarily the religious, because, again, I'll come back to that a little bit later on. The idea of the mother as the stimulator of learning, not just the nurture. Here we come to the idea of education from the cradle to the grave, which we're talking about now, lifelong learning. And they're saying it starts with the mother. The mother isn't just the nurturer of the child, but the stimulator. And the gifts which I've laid out here, and again, I'll refer to them a bit later on. The first gift is the mother's to the child of a ball that the child then indulges in sensory learning. The touch, what does the baby do? Lifts up something, shoves it in their mouth. So we immediately have feel, tactile and taste. And interestingly, there was a lovely exhibition in Froebel Maynooth on Wednesday, and it was an artist in residence and her response to Froebel's occupations. And she had on display her responses and work she had done with the students. But the interesting thing, in her little presentation, she said, I want you to go over and feel my work. And of course, immediately that's Froebel. The idea of touch and that there's a sensory response. Most unusual for an artist to ask to touch their work, So the other interesting thing that comes through from both of them is women as teachers. And Froebel was one of the first, the Irish Sisters of Mercy in Baggot Street in 1836, began to train women as teachers, which after it became Carysford Training College, was closed in the late 1980s. Froebel trained women as infant teachers, because he began as more and more, and there's a misunderstanding about Froebel. A lot of people saw Froebel as only for young children, but he just saw it as the importance of early childhood education. Like when I started teaching, the young one was put into the babies, or the infants, babies as they were called then, and then high babies, or senior infants. And the master, either the principal or the most experienced teacher, was in 6th class. It's been reversed now. The best teacher is in infants, and the best teaching, I think, goes on in infants before books come into it. But that's another day's work. But both Rousseau, first of all, Pestalozzi, Froebel, and Maria Edgeworth all questioned the use of textbooks and the intrusion of textbooks into the idea of hands-on learning, concrete learning, children exploring and discovering and so on. And the minute you start with textbooks, a lot of that gets put aside. So the importance of the early years was very common to both of them. So this rejection of rote learning was hugely important. Again, it came through in Rousseau. Pestalozzi, as I said, was the first to try and put it into practice with a very practical education. And education for all, of course. Out of the Enlightenment comes the idea that humankind is not just a pathway to heaven. We're not on earth just to be on a pathway to heaven, but that humankind is of value in itself. That doesn't preclude going to heaven, but that it's of value in itself. And therefore, if humankind is of value in itself, then we must bring them to their fullest potential. How do we do that? Education. So here we see the beginnings of the opening out of the education of the common person. And much maligned, and for good reason in recent years, some religious orders and that have members who have behaved poorly and covered up and so on. We all know that in recent history. But in the early days, they were quite revolutionary. They were reformers. They were introducing the idea of educating the poor. The Christian Brothers, Edmund Rice, 1802. The Mercy Sisters I've mentioned before, 1804. And before that, the Presentation Sisters, 1775, was about educating the poor. So this is all around the same time. So all of these things are connected, and I think that came out in the previous speakers as well, that nothing is in isolation. Someone here was asking where does Montessori and so on fit into that. It's a progression. So children learn best. This is what the two of them felt. If you read different words, but I think the kernel is curiosity and inquiry, exploration, discovery, questioning, creativity, sensory learning, children's own environment, their own interests and their own experience. Look at the 1971 curriculum, look at the 99 curriculum here in Ireland. I didn't include curriculum in these, and the new primary school framework. All of that is in there. So one of the things I would say about my own interest in all of this is it's still current. It is the study of the history of education, but look at all the things that we're still trying to do. Froebel said it will take 300 years. He's 200 done. Maria Edgeworth is 225 done. We're a long way along the road, but I don't want to do that Bertie Ahern one about more to do and all that. But you know what I mean? There's still plenty to do. So, sorry, did I skipped one? No, it is my motivation. Yeah, so again, this idea of the move away from corporal punishment, and many in the room, I would suggest, remember corporal punishment, certainly in their own school days. I certainly do. I went to a Christian Brothers school, and it's etched on my memory, not for all good reasons. But both of them challenged this. Again, the idea of original sin is that you have to be cleansed. The child has to be cleansed. If you believe children are innately good, then it's about how you behave towards those children, and then how you respect the child and trust the child. Give the child. We've all seen green schools. Those of you who are teachers, green schools is a fabulous example of children being given responsibility and thriving on that responsibility. You know, primary schools now have schools councils and children making decisions and doing surveys and so on. That's trusting the children, and children invariably respond very, very positively to that. Most of the children, most of the time. So Froebel said naughtiness has its origin in the lack of correctly guided occupations. So if the child is interested, the child will continue to work. I always think of the analogy of the child on the beach with the bucket and spade. To this day, despite screens and everything else, you bring children to a beach, they spend all day in and out with a bucket and spade, filling a hole in the sand, and you're absolutely knackered yourself at the end of it. And they're still going, can we, you know. And even teenagers, given the chance to play, will play. And one of the things, actually, I don't think I've included it, but Maria Edgeworth talks about how children are stopped from playing at a certain age, from virtue to, I think I have the quote later on, we'll come back to it. And Froebel also said, encourage diligence rather than achievement. If you do not, there will be no need to talk about reward and punishment. Now, that's ideally, but if we're working towards that, and we don't have competition, and every child is doing their best, and every child is progressing, then every child is successful. If we have competition, one child is successful. Okay, so Froebel was saying this 200 years ago, and Maria Edgeworth was of the same thinking. The pleasure of this exercise, there's a sense of intrinsic motivation. The pleasure of this exercise, variety, senses, observing, all faculties exercise in itself is in itself sufficient. If the child is interested and the child is active in their learning, then we don't need to be overly supervisory in it. Generosity, benevolence, prudence, perseverance. The reward is affection, esteem, confidence. So a sense of intrinsic motivation. So what were the key things they looked at? Froebel, again, I tried to juxtaposition them. Maybe they're using different words. I probably could have included gardens instead of outdoors, looking at the chart inside. Play, both of them valued play. Froebel was the first to say play is a child's work. And that play in itself is of value. It's very good educationally, but it's a part of a child's development. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Kindergarten, we've all heard of the kindergarten, but people don't necessarily associate it with Froebel. It's Froebel who sent the children on that when he was the tutor out into the garden. Sent them out with questions, they came back, and he helped them get the answers, and he sent them out with more questions. The gifts, which are here, you could have a look at them if you like. He had 6 gifts that he made himself. He left the drawings for the other 4. They were very mathematical, so you could have very directed play with them. But again, it was about hands-on, concrete materials. You could add, subtract, symmetry. So he talked about, sorry, I'll come back to that in a minute. Occupations was another thing, and Maria Edgeworth talked about activities. Occupations, again, I'll come back to them, but you'll see them in most infant classes today. The mother songs, movement games. Moral content, I think, is in both of what they're talking about. They're saying we're not, religious in the sense of an organizational faith, but there is a moral content involved. And Maria Edgeworth talked about play, her outdoors toys and tasks. She talked about physical activities, the arts, drawing, and this moral content. So play is a child's work, is what Froebel said. And there's probably the easiest book to read on Froebel is by a man called Liebschner, Joachim Liebschner, who taught in the Froebel College in Roehampton in London, German, and he wrote Play is a child's work, and was a quote from Froebel. So he said free play and directed play. So sometimes you allow the children just to play and to invent their own play, and other times you might have an objective or a target, and teachers will know that. And I think the art of the teacher is when do I intervene and when do I leave them alone. And sometimes as teachers, and I'm including myself here, we intervene too much and too early maybe in the play. Children develop through play, children learn through play, they make sense of the world around them through play. And there's many examples of that. People get children to play, play therapy. They get children to play with things, and they see what's bothering the child maybe. So Froebel said they express what's inside them through play, and he said making the outer inner and the inner outer. What's inside them comes out in their play, and what's in the world around them, they make sense of it through play. Maria Edgeworth looked at children's love of play. She criticised some of the toys that were being given to children, and all they did was dismantle them. She talked about children dismantling toys, and she felt that was partly they were trying to find out how it worked. So a child dismantling a radio, for instance, in more modern times, that was common enough practice. Or do you remember the old alarm clocks? You take off the back of the alarm clock to find out how it worked, or a wristwatch, which this is a wristwatch for younger people. No one seems to wear them at all nowadays. Anyway, build up, pull down again, the idea of building blocks and letting them be broken down again. And children do that all the time. What we've induced in children is a fear of failure. Children are not afraid until we tell them to be afraid of dismantling and breaking up things, and well, not destroying them, but breaking them down to see what they're made of. Bricks being that you put bricks in front of the child, they build them up, and then they knock them down, they build something else. She talks about physical activity, pieces of wood, balls, pulleys, wheels, strings. Leave us to ourselves. Don't interfere with our play. Leave us to ourselves. And there's the quote, virtue to crime. So when a child is young, play is accepted to this day. And in schools, I hope this new primary framework will push play further and further up to school. Everybody wants to play. Everybody given a chance will play. So she saw it as being from virtue to crime based on the child's age. So the kindergarten, the children's own environment. And again, I think that the pre-71 curriculum was very, very much nationalistic, patriotic in Ireland, talking about because we needed to unify the state after the Civil War. And it was very much this idea of a national identity, of patriotism and all. And the local environment was lost in that until the 71 curriculum. And one of the strengths of the 71 curriculum was this idea of the children's own environment. And it's very strong now in 71, 99 and the new framework. Children actively working in Kerry for the garden, and similarly with Maria Edgeworth. She had them outside playing and doing things in the garden. It wasn't just about admiring the garden, it was doing things in it and working in it. The responsibility and trust, which I've spoken about, inquiring, questioning, exploring, discovering, experimenting, these were all part of it. They say that Froebel's, the pockets on his coat were torn because children were always grabbing at him, wanting to either show him something or ask him something or whatever. She, in her chapter on geography and chronology, she said learning must be real and relevant. There's a person I'll refer to later on, Tagore in Calcutta, a much revered philosopher, dramatist, poet, literary person in India. He said, geography is about standing at your own door and looking and seeing what's made, what your local area is made of. You don't learn geography from a book. When circumstances excite a particular subject, then is the moment to produce the symbols which record and communicate knowledge. Any mode which unites amusement with instruction, observe surroundings and articulate findings. So that the art of the teacher is to guide the children's interests into the learning, and that they're more inclined. Like geography to me is continually evolving. When I was at school, hands up who remember how many sugar factories were in Ireland? 4. How many are left? None. So geography changes all the time. Okay, and it's about seeing what's around us and engaging with what's around us. Okay, I'm flying along. Froebel's gifts. These are the gifts, which, as I said, very mathematical. But he allowed for also for children's play. So forms of life, he said, which was representational, and the building using the box. They're beautiful pieces. These were not made by Froebel himself, but he did make the original gifts, and they're absolutely perfect. They're beautiful things. They're quite expensive, but we have similar things in primary school now. So people can play with them themselves later on if they like it. Forms of life. So that's the building and representation. Forms of knowledge, sorting, differentiation, arithmetic, counting, fractions, all can be done with these. Forms of beauty then, pattern, design, symmetry. So here's the expression and the artistic and the free element of the gifts. In her arithmetic, I was very interested in what she said, the conceptual understanding. She was into this whole idea of the concept rather than the formula, which we're still fighting with, aren't we? Hands-on approach, concrete materials. She talked about combination of the numbers with real objects, that children would retain more if they saw the numbers, we're learning the numbers through real objects. She talked about place value and stones, getting a group of 10 and exchanging it and so on. She saw how important maths language was, and more modern version of subtraction. She was actually talking about regrouping and not the borrow and pay back that many people learned, but the idea of decomposition and regrouping in subtraction. She was talking about that 200 years ago. I think it came into Irish education in the 1970s, 80s, maybe 80s. Huh? I can't remember. Okay, so the occupations then were something that Froebel said was a lead on from the gifts. And he saw the perforations. Do you remember those older ones among the audience? Do you remember you could get the templates and you got a little pin and like a thimble and you punctured it and then you held it up and you had a template of animals and so on. And Froebel, that was a very important part of children's play in Froebel's time. Sewing, drawing, thread games, you call them, weaving, interlacing, paper cutting, folding, clay modelling, sand play. And we have many of those things. Anyone who's working with early childhood and in infant classrooms, hopefully it'll move up the school. The idea of activity, skills and creativity, build, construct, model, weave, sew, cut out, paste, fold, print. All of these things are being done in schools now. Maria Edgeworth similarly had, she didn't call them occupations, but she did, well, in different contexts, she did toys, tasks, concrete materials, drawing, cutting, modelling, weaving. Same kind of ideas. Active manual employment of children is of consequence. There's improvement and there's happiness in that. Children are happy working away at these things. Okay, the mother songs were very important to Froebel because it was saying the mother is the first stimulator. Now again, we have to be thinking of the context of the times. We would now say the parent is the primary educator, but he was talking about the mother, similar songs, music, lullabies, nursery rhymes, art. He used to do drawings and all of his mother songs. And Maria Edgeworth, the literary people would be much better at this than me, but stories were hugely important in her engagement with children around education. Lullabies, stories for and of children, and also something that I haven't got there, but that she used colloquial language in her stories, which was quite revolutionary, but is now accepted as proper educational theory, that you would use the mother language of the children. Dramas for children, she created little dramas for the children as well. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. How am I doing? Am I all right for time?
Yep.
Okay. So Froebel then had movement games. I mean, again, when you think of children being sort of made to sit and be quiet and not disturb the adults and, be sitting there quiet, out of the way, not bothering people. Froebel said, no, children should be able to move. Again, the kindergarten, obviously, but then independence was emphasised, that nursery rhymes, there should be actions with them. Children's games, he thought he valued children's games. Ball games, wander games. Talk about wander again, wandering and wondering. He went wander games for them so they could go off and wander and come back to him. So again, the trust and that was there as well. Representational games. Maria Edgeworth again talked about physical activities, practical puzzles, wide spaces for exploration, communal activity, pieces of wood of various shapes and sizes which they may build up and pull down. Again, the balls, the pulleys, the wheels, the strings, all of these are again. So they may use different words, but the thinking and the action around them is very, very similar. There were differences, I think. Maybe other speakers can correct me on some of this. Froebel didn't refer to gender. He just talked about children. He didn't refer to. He had a Lutheran background, which again was the more Puritan strain of and his own experiences as a child. The more Puritan strain of Protestantism, but he was very spiritual, and he saw God in nature. So the creator, he saw we must be created because we see God in all things around us, and God is the creator. That was his kind of spiritual thing. He was not overtly political, but the kindergartens were banned. Now, there's two theories on this. One is that he was mixed up with his brother or his cousin, who was arrested for, I think, non-payment of taxes or something like that, and that he was associated with that. That's one theory. The other theory was that the kindergarten was banned in 1851, just a year before he died, I think, and it was post-1848, but there was a lot of reform movements around Europe, which were then crushed. And many people see it as part of that kindergarten was too revolutionary and too threatening. And I have a personal story about that. I was involved in curriculum development in a small country called Bhutan. And the minister in charge of this project, I brought him on a tour of our what you call them, schools, what do you call it? When you start off, you have 10 schools. No, just a certain number of schools. A pilot project, that's the word I'm looking for, a pilot project. So I bring him around the schools in the pilot project. And of course, in Eastern cultures, they're very differential towards adults or towards people in authority. So normally a child would bend their head if someone of authority came into the room. So he goes into the room, the children had all their work up around the walls and all the rest of this, which we were trying to get them to display children's work and all. And the next thing, the children started asking him questions. So we come outside afterwards, and we're walking back down to about half a day's walk down to the car that we're in. And I said, that was great, wasn't it? He says, what do you mean? I said, like, children asking all those questions. Might have been good for them, not necessarily good for me. So there is always a threat to the people in authority. Maria Edgeworth was seen to be very, very concerned about the education of the girls. Like, she had her own ideas about how children should be educated, but was that suiting what was expected of society of girls? And that seemed to be a constant pull, and she had great anxiety around that, I sensed, as to what she should be doing for the girls, as opposed to her broad view of education. Again, she was from I think her family, her father and herself, coming out of the Enlightenment, or from what we would call the humanist wing of Protestantism, similar to the Quakers, maybe a softer, you think of great educationists like Erasmus, Comenius, who came from that same kind of more progressive wing of Protestant rather than the Puritan wing. They espoused secular education, opposed religiously segregated schooling. Now, they deliberately said, we're not political. But it's a very political thing to do at a very turbulent time. And it reminds me of, there was a cover in Newsweek back in the 70s when John, that's the last Kennedy, Edward Kennedy crashed the car and went into and he left, and the poor, his female assistant died. And the thing was that he left the accident, not having the accident, but he left the accident. And of course, this was a stain on his character. So his opponent in the next election stands up and says, I won't mention Chappaquiddick. I won't mention Chappaquiddick. I won't mention Chappaquiddick. So it was a bit like that, I think, with Maria Edgeworth. We're not political, but she was making very political statements. Everything she did was political, with a small p. Okay. So, sorry, I should have moved on to that sooner. So someone asked this question earlier on. I think the threads to modern times. Montessori reference, Froebel. Montessori would be seen as opposing Froebel, but I would prefer sometimes to look at both the similarities and the differences. Similarities were observation of children, respect for childhood, allowing children to play, but she was much more restrictive. She was much more step-by-step, much more controlled. Froebel was much more about the creative and the freer and the openness, and that's where they diverge. But I think the basic thing of respect for childhood and observing children and making that your curriculum were very similar. Dewey in America, the godfather of progressive education in America, he referenced Froebel. said he was way before his time, and he introduced the idea of project work, which we now use. And he said that children's learning should be real. Education should be part of their lives. That school was their life. It was a community that was real and serious. And again, that goes back to this idea of trust and respect. Gandhi and Tagore, I mentioned earlier, in India, Gandhi set up his idea of going back to the wisdom of the locality, of learning the skills of the local thing. And this was in opposition, of course, politically to the empire. Tagore, I mentioned before, he was actually the first non-English speaking winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, championed by W.B. Yeats in Europe, 1913. But he's revered in Bengal in India, and wonderful to read what he was talking about education. Again, get them out there, get them playing, get them active, and so on. Nyerere in Tanzania, same thing. Villagization was his Ujamaa villagization, which was about making the village important and not having people through education emigrating from the village or migrating from the village, but rather that the village should be valued and the skills and wisdom, because formal education can take away a lot of that sort of wisdom and so on. So I personally see trends all around among those kind of people. Freire, I jumped over Freire there, of course, who said no one owns the knowledge. We create knowledge. Everybody carries a bag into the room and everybody contributes to the knowledge. And that unless the learning is relevant, people lose it. And I was involved in an Oxfam project in Vietnam about 30 years ago. And I was walking around these little villages up in the mountains, collecting these young teachers who were teaching in one-teacher schools and had no much training. So we were bringing them together to do workshop training on basic methodologies and that. And we're walking along and we passed this village and I said, is there no teacher up there? No. That village has fallen into illiteracy. And we're going saying, you learn to ride a bike, you never forget. You learn to swim, you never forget. But you can fall into illiteracy if it's not relevant to your life. So what Freire said was, I have a group of young mothers here. What's the most important thing for them? The care of their baby. So he based his literacy classes around primary health care. He had a group of farmers in the evening. What were they concerned about? Water, irrigation, so on, fertilizers. So they had to read the fertilizer bag. So let's build our literacy around that because it was relevant to them. This village in Vietnam, the literacy was not relevant to them. So the literacy program was being done, so they lost it very quickly. So all of those things that we use nowadays, sensory learning, integration, project work, differentiation, child observation, child-centeredness, stages of development. My first time teaching infants, and I asked a nun who's a fabulous infant teacher, I said, give me some advice. He said, Brian, hasten slowly. And I think it's the best advice anybody ever gave me about teaching, hasten slowly. Outside work, using the local environment. And that's what we're still playing around with those, the primary school framework, this 99 curriculum, 71 curriculum or attempts. Going right back to the 1900 curriculum, which was very progressive, Belmore Commission in 1896 sent their inspectors to Europe. They looked at Froebel's gifts, for instance, and they tried to bring that. It was too radical. And as most teachers will tell you, easy for you lot to be writing a curriculum. We're the ones who have to implement it, and it's never as easy to implement. Easy to write a curriculum. Most people in this room could write a curriculum, a good curriculum in a weekend. Go in and implement it is the hard part. Okay, sorry, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Thank you very much.
One or two questions now. The question down here, yes?
Can I ask two questions?
Yeah.
Right. For a young person who's interested in becoming a primary school teacher, if you wouldn't mind to tell about the process of entering now for a young person who's interested in becoming a Froebel.
Well, it's the CAO points.
No interview.
And no interview anymore, except for the graduates and mature students. The interviews were taking up a huge amount of time to no great benefit. It was researched, and that's why they were wrong. People can't perform at interviews, as we all know.
And the points, so what's the average?
About 500, I think, is it? Jamie would know more than 90.
Yeah.
You know, if you, I can talk to you afterwards. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Milos.
Small there, Brian, about the influence of women on children's education and Edward's interest in teaching girls. It's in various school living studies at least, the cognitive abilities of the mother is one of the influencers of children's education.
Yeah, I worked on a project with the Dublin Inner City Partnership many years ago, and one of the bits of research we did was we interviewed young mothers in Northeast Inner City for a lot of that Kinahan few that gone through recently. Hutch, that's the other. Fabulous community workers and so on. A lot going on in the community, but a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment, a lot of drugs. We did this project around young mothers, and we asked them, because we saw them as the most vulnerable. Young mothers, 16, single, maybe with the support of their own mother, so the grandmother might only be in her 30s, who may not have huge parenting skills. But we asked those young mothers, what was the most important thing? Like, even though the school system, society to some extent, maybe family had let them down, the main thrust of their answer was, I want my child to stay in school longer. I want my girl to be more educated than I was, despite their own poor experience. It was very interesting that it was right across the board. That's what they said.
It is.
So we must take cognizance of people's circumstances can be very difficult, but they do value education, and we see what education can lift in Ireland.
Now, one question from Shamie there from Froebel College.
Yeah. Just following on that point, I think one of the problems in society is we don't value early childhood education. I can never understand how somebody who's teaching a 4-year-old in a kindergarten is not paid the same as a primary school teacher, and who's not accredited the same, and who's not valued the same, and their courses, they've improved in the last couple of years and so on, but there still isn't a parity of esteem there between the preschool, often set up by local women in the back garden shed. Now, we've made a little bit of progress the last couple of years, we've a long way to go, but again, because society doesn't value this, it's not happening quick enough. But just one comment, and I know Brian very well because I've had early morning coffee with him every morning for about 20 years, and he recently retired, and we miss him hugely in the Froebel department in Maynooth. But like what has been given here this morning by Brian is such a healthy, holistic view of education and the rich conceptualization of childhood. So just when you mentioned the word observation there, this week I was in the supermarket, and I was observing some parents, and they bring their kids around in buggies. And rather than talking about the apples and oranges, all the kids were on screens. I was at a funeral this week, and to keep the kids happy, the parents just start shoving screens at the kids. Go and play at the screen. Now, this is a huge worry, because I looked at a bit of research then. In 6 jurisdictions, Irish children have the highest amount of screen time compared to any other country in Europe, way more than Germany. And screens are a curse on childhood. And what we need to do is, this is all 200 years old, but it's so relevant today because Brian mentioned about play therapy and so on. But that's not just Brian Tubbert's stories. There's a fantastic book published recently by Patsy Salberg and William Doyle called Let the Children Play. And it shows a huge amount of research from the American pediatrics schools and so on of the value of play. But we're losing it in Ireland before our eyes. So I want you all to do for the next week, do a bit of observation and see what kids are doing, because it is extremely, I say, it's a curse in
Talk about risky play, so you let a child climb a tree or walk along the wall and fall off, and they get a lot more balance the next time. Health and safety is used in the next.
Now, thanks a million again to Brian Bonney, and all the